when you say the word testosterone, immediately one gender comes to mind when everybody thinks testosterone. But do you agree or disagree with the fact that testosterone levels actually play a pretty reasonable role in women's lives as well?
Oh, for sure. And it's not just limited to women after menopause. Premenopausal women, testosterone levels are going to have a big impact, and it goes beyond just libido. So everyone just thinks testosterone, sex drive.
Please spell out to everybody that we don't go for testosterone simply for sexual dysfunction, that there's a whole series of even better reasons, if you can imagine that, about why testosterone should be brought into someone's life. Hello there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Orthopreneurs podcast. Today, we're going to blow your mind because you've heard me bring people on before talking about health and wellness. And Dr. Jeff Galvin from Vitality Medical Wellness was on here a while back and did a couple of episodes with us. And today, we're lucky enough to have James O'Hara from Gillett Health. Is that what I would refer to it, James?
Yeah, that's right. Gillett Health.
Yeah, James, tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, how you ended up getting to where you are today. And then we'll dive into some of the stuff today. It's going to kind of blow your mind. If you get uncomfortable, folks, listening to this today, that's my goal. And you'll understand why, because we now know medically things that we as orthodontists and people in the medical community, we know these things. The question is, are we living them? And we'll blow your mind with a few of them. But James, let me jump back to you and give everybody a little bit of background about who you are, where you come from, and then we can jump into having some fun.
So my background, I became a registered nurse, and probably what steered me into the medical field even before that was a lot of traumas and broken bones growing up. So I had a condition known as compartment syndrome, which it sounds like your listeners would be very familiar with. But for anyone who's not, basically you have a trauma, and that induces enough swelling to where the compartment becomes full of the swelling, and then you can't perfuse the tissue, you get pressure on the nerve, and you can have some long-term loss of function and tissue damage. Unfortunately, in my case, I had a good mother and a good surgeon, one of which got me to the hospital, and the other performed emergency surgery. I'll let your listeners figure that one out. But that was my start. So I was on the patient side of things, and then went into orthopedics. And that was my first job as a registered nurse, looking at joint replacements, a lot of, IM hip nailings, older individuals who have fallen, which I think it's important to talk about a sort of muscle-centric or strength-centric approach to aging, because you don't want to be on an operating table having a hip fracture repaired, because we know the mortality rate for those sorts of things, it's very bad within a year of having a hip fracture. So we can get into the details of that a little bit later on. But primarily, I spent my time in the hospital as an RN working in a cardiac capacity. So on the step-down ICU unit, taking care of open heart surgeries, people that had came in with chest pain, some of which were heart attacks, some of which were not, taking care of post-stroke patients. And those things are entirely too preventable to be happening at the rates that they are today. So that's what prompted me to go back, continue my education, and become a family nurse practitioner, so that we can kind of look upstream from that issue and hopefully get to some of those people, because I realized there's things I can do to prevent those things in myself, and then I can teach other people those same things and set them up to have a much longer health span. So I suppose that's the short version.
And, I said it earlier, I really do hope we get people to squirm in their seats a little bit today. I hope some of them hear about the way they're working out, or the way they're eating, or the way they're relaxing, or a number of things, or just the way they're living, and maybe, just maybe, get a little uncomfortable, because I think discomfort will get them to take some action. Because after all, my whole entire purpose for all of this is simply to help people live their best, most profitable, low-stress lives. And what good is a profitable life if it ends at 75 or 80? Or, we'll dive into more about health span versus lifespan and all those things in a little bit. But let's have some fun. Let's kick it off with something simple, like carbohydrates. Let's start with carbs. What kicked America into the obesity crisis was the food pyramid of the 80s. And that in the 1980s, they came out with the food pyramid, which was heavy in grains and heavy in wheats and everything else. And I don't know what your thoughts are. Do you have any thoughts on let's just go broader and say carbohydrates in general, refined carbohydrates, and the idea of how we can. I've read and heard and listened to a lot of people talk about low carbohydrate diets being really, really really helpful nowadays. And that the studies, by the way, everybody, everything we're talking about on here, we're not even going to cite the studies. Just trust that everything in here is literature based. And if you don't believe me, and James, you could jump in, uh, go listen to Peter Attia, go listen to Andy Huberman. We're talking Stanford, researchers who've written books and have podcasts on this stuff. And so, agree, James, everything we're talking about today is lit based.
Yeah, we're going to be very evidence based. There's a ton of data out there. People can find these things, just like we were talking before the show. There's really no secrets out there. It's just a matter of getting the data in front of people, getting them to take a new perspective compared to maybe what we were thinking about 40 years ago, as far as nutrition and as far as cardiac prevention or any other number of subjects.
You're being very kind when you say 40 years ago, because right now in this country, it's happening this minute. It's happening every single day in physicians' offices around the country, where because of the speed at which they're being seen and the inability to spend time with patients, it is indeed unfortunate. But this country has now become a two-tier medical system with people who get the basic care and those who can afford to go get concierge care, like I choose to do, like you can help provide with people. Because what your doctor out there, folks, is telling you, if you're going to a regular physician who's on your insurance, chances are the things we're going to talk about today, they're probably not talking to you about. And I don't need you to respond to that one, James, and get yourself in hot water. I'm happy enough to be the guy who does that. But let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates and diets. And what's the modern approach towards dieting for a better health span? And we'll define a health span the way Peter Attia, I think the MD researcher out of Stanford, who says, a health span is living to your 80s, 90s, and beyond and enjoying your entire life until the end, until some illness or accident or something takes your life. You're traveling the world at 90 or 95. You're enjoying a good neurocognitive life. You're able to be ambulatory and move around and do what you want to do. And what good is living a lifespan of 95 if you have tubes hooked up to you, if you can barely function, if you can't remember your family, if all those things go on. And so we're going to talk about a diet, if you don't mind, to help support a healthy health span, not just lifespan. And so I'll let you take it from there.
And you said it exactly. So being able to do the things you want to do, regardless of how old you are. So you want to, another way to put it is the compression of mortality. So you don't have the last 20 years of your life with chronic disease, hauling an oxygen tank around with you or anything like that. That you really are living life to the fullest as long as possible, living a better life, as you said, the theme of the podcast is. So as far as carbohydrates, the problem with the average American and carbohydrates is that they are, 90% of people consuming too many refined carbohydrates. So that's part of what makes low carb or no carb sort of diets effective, because you're basically eliminating a lot of the garbage by moving to the lower carbohydrate model. So if someone is eating, a lot of protein, they're eating some vegetables, some fruits. Hopefully those fruits have some fiber in them, like, berries, for example, great example. They still have some, carbohydrates in them, but they also have a lot of fiber and some beneficial plant chemicals. So it's not zero carb necessarily. Some people do tremendous on a zero carb diet. They find a source of mental clarity that they can't replicate on any other diet model. And for those people, that's a great fit for them. And they don't necessarily have to add in any arbitrary number of carbohydrates, 50 carbs, 100 carbs. Now, basically, my practice is finding the diet that people feel well on and then modifying things around that. And the biggest thing is going to be calories. So with carbohydrates, too high, you're going to have a lot of insulin production. The average person with more insulin production, that's going to lower your sex hormone binding globulin, so protein that regulates primarily androgen delivery to the tissue, so testosterone, DHT. And when you lower that SHBG, you're going to see the total testosterone levels go down as well. And free testosterone is probably going to be metabolized faster. So this is probably, if I'm putting together a theory here, that's why we have this afternoon crash and this sort of epidemic of people just wanting to go home and take a nap after they get done working. For men anyway, you have this nice LH spike actually during REM sleep. That's going to be your highest testosterone level. Obviously, we don't wake people up at 4 a.m. to check their testosterone, but if you are checking your testosterone, which you probably won't get, like you said, at your normal GP visit once a year, seeing your doctor, nurse practitioner, you're probably not going to get a testosterone level unless you specifically ask for it. And even then, people are tending to face resistance. This is something that I've seen, I assume something that you've seen as well, but an early morning fasted testosterone level, that's going to give you a pretty good idea of where your hormonal baseline is. And having that alongside a sex hormone binding globulin, that's something that can kind of steer diet a little bit, because if I have someone who is doing a lot of high intensity training and they are on a ketogenic diet, for example, they may have a very high SHBG. They may have a total testosterone that looks fine on paper. Maybe it's 600, 700 nanogram per deciliter. But we plug that into a calculator or do the assay, and their free testosterone is hypogonadal. That's
Right.
typically an exception to the rule, but that could be a reason for me to say, hey, you would actually benefit from adding a little bit more carbohydrate into your diet. You don't have to go crazy with it. But basically, when I'm looking at diet, I'm looking at macronutrients first tier and calories. So dietary fat, whenever you go low carb, you're going to naturally increase your intake of dietary fat, which supports hormone production. There are some studies out there, one looking specifically at your average middle-aged men, resistance training on a very low carbohydrate diet. They went from their baseline sort of Western American diet to a keto or a very low carb, and they saw their total testosterone go up about 200 nanogram per deciliter, which is a pretty incredible increase. So if someone is kind of teetering in that gray area, and they're like, I don't know, do I need to go full into testosterone, or do I need to just tough it out and wait until I drop to below 300? Dietary changes can have a pretty big impact there. So dietary fat specifically, if people want some rough percentages here, something like 35 to 50% of calories from fat. It can be even higher, but that's sort of the minimum I like to work with. And there can be exceptions. Like if someone has a gallbladder issue, then we certainly don't want them loading up on tons and tons of fat, giving themselves discomfort, but within reason, of course.
And can I interrupt you there just for
For
a
sure.
second? Because you've covered a lot of good ground there in such a short period of time. There's literally like 10 questions I want to ask you for everybody out there. So let's rapid fire these a little bit, because I want to get on to so many other things with you. First question: when you say the word testosterone, immediately one gender comes to mind when everybody thinks testosterone. But do you agree or disagree with the fact that testosterone levels actually play a pretty reasonable role in women's lives as well?
Oh, for sure. And it's not just limited to women after menopause. Premenopausal women, testosterone levels are going to have a big impact, and it goes beyond just libido. So everyone just thinks
Right.
testosterone, sex drive, but there was actually a paper out of
That
the
was question
UK.
number two, by the way, is please spell out to everybody that we don't go for testosterone simply for sexual dysfunction, that there's a whole series of even better reasons, if you can imagine that, about why testosterone should be brought into someone's life.
Apologize, I think I was jumping ahead there a little bit, but out of the UK, which they may actually beat us here in the States to an FDA-approved testosterone preparation specifically for women. I think they have a trial with a patch going on now. But they had basically a survey that went out to women who were treated with testosterone, because this is done off-label all the time at appropriate doses for women. And they had not just improvements in libido, but also mood, energy, their stress levels. And it wasn't 100% across the board. It's like, maybe 33% of people experience improvements in their mood. Maybe it's 40% that improve libido, that sort of thing. So it's not 100% for every single person, but it just shows that it's not just a one-trick pony when it comes to testosterone. Same can be said for men. It's going to affect more than just libido and erectile function.
You mentioned a guy who's in his 50s, middle-aged, gets off a Western diet, goes on keto, gets in a resistance exercise, and that's me. That's who you're referring to here. I was the guy who did triathlons. My daughter was born at the hospital. I forgot something at home, so I threw on my pajamas and I ran 14 miles home, years ago, just because I was a runner, I was a biker, I was a swimmer. I thought that was health. I thought that was the way to age, and that's the way to take care of yourself. And then I started looking around at old runners, and I didn't like what I saw, and I knew too many people who passed early who were
Mhm.
great endurance athletes. The history is littered with amazing endurance athletes who died at a younger age. But I got into resistance training, just like you mentioned, and I got on some testosterone because at 55, I wanted the neurocognitive, the sleep, the lack of joint pain that I was always having throughout my body, right? Just I wanted to recover faster, and I got myself on much more resistance exercise at that point and ketogenic diet. And in 5.5 months since doing it, and I'm going to report more on that with Jeff Galvin, who I did it through. I'm going to report more on that in the next couple of months. I think I lost 24 pounds of fat. based on the in-body. I had a DEXA scan to start with it, but I think I've lost 24 pounds of fat, gained about 8.5 pounds of muscle, and seen a body composition rate drop of about 12 to 13% in body fat, which again, nobody would ever look at me and go, my God, look how heavy he is. But visceral fat is a killer, literally and figuratively. And the DEXA scan had picked up that I had a little more visceral fat than I should have. And so the only thing I say now to my business partner, Doug Shaw, is, he's 39, I'm 55. I only wish I'd known this stuff earlier. I wish that my physicians knew this stuff earlier. I wish someone had sat with me when I was in my late 30s and said, Glenn, running 20 miles is not the way to health. Sure, you need to have some aerobic fitness, a baseline of good aerobic fitness, but putting on muscle mass is really important as you age. And jumping up and down and beating yourself up with weights in your hands and damaging your joints is not the way to get healthy over the next 30, 40, 50, 70 years of your life. And by the way, you should consider getting a blood test done, and you should be monitoring your testosterone levels, and you should be monitoring all your sort of what I'll refer to as the microcholesterols, all the stuff in cholesterol that's beyond triglycerides and LDL and HDL, which we're learning play a small role. And so I'd love for you to jump in here and talk a little bit about, at what age should somebody start really paying attention to this stuff? If I'm 35 to 40 years old to 45 years old, and I've got 3 kids and I'm tired and I'm not sleeping the way I should because my kids are running me ragged and I don't get enough time for myself, and I'm working hard and I'm not eating the way I really should, but I'm exercising a lot. And I mean, should I really be caring about this right now in my late 30s, or can this stuff wait?
Yeah, so the best time would be yesterday. The next best time is today. So, the sooner the better. If you kind of look at your health like an investment, then you want to start sooner rather than later, because you may be able to have a less aggressive sort of program and build out a lifestyle, as opposed to really having to do a total 180 with your health if you are waiting until you're 60 and these issues start popping up. So taking a very proactive and preventive approach. Like you said, you had a DEXA scan, which really is only going to get ordered in women who either have a history of a family member that had some bone loss, or if they are postmenopausal, they might ask their doctor and get a DEXA scan. But that's not going to tell them about, like you mentioned, the visceral fat, which is what we know is associated with type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, inflammation, excess aromatization, testosterone converting into estradiol, which does inhibit some of your gonadotropin production. So less LH, less testosterone production by the Leydig cells. So, a lot of men, because of their adipose tissue and specifically visceral adipose tissue, are sort of, kneecapping their testosterone production. And you just don't know it because the visceral fat is not what you see. You see a lot of variability in visceral fat. So this is something we actually looked at, like Harvard and all these blogs will say your visceral fat should be about 10% of your body fat. And I had seen so many DEXA scans of people and looking at their visceral fat and their body fat percent. I just said, there's no way that this is what it should be or that this is average. So yeah, our goal is for people starting off, depends on their body composition, but getting that below a pound is kind of our stage 1 target, and then below half a pound would be stage 2. And this is something you actually don't need a physician or nurse practitioner's order for in most places. There's a ton of these DEXA chains that they all have the same machines, and they can give you those 4 pieces of data. So your lean body mass, your body fat percentage, your visceral fat, and then they don't always do a specific lumbar or femoral bone density, but they'll kind of give you your global bone density, like head to toe, how many pounds of bones do you have? And are those above or below average in terms of density? And then you can look at your T-score and see where you're at. Because if you have a negative T-score at 40, like you're going to be in for a bad time 20,
Can you
30 years down
describe
the road.
a T-score, by the way, just so people understand?
Yeah, for sure. So a T-score would be where you are compared to the average healthy 30-year-old. So we want people to always have at least that, if not better, bone density. So if I see a T-score that comes back at a -1 standard deviation below a 30-year-old, that's problematic to me. I'd rather see their T-score at 1 or at 2. I've seen some T-scores that are off the charts, not necessarily for a good reason. People who have a history of being very obese, they have good bone density. But again, their visceral fat is going to be way too high, body fat percentage way too high. And then our goal is to preserve, if not add to their amount of lean body mass, just like it sounds like you did, lost the bad stuff, added more of the good stuff.
Right. And again, the story nowadays is we're not looking to lose weight. That's right. For years, there's so many things that like it's kind of weird. There have been movies out there where someone suddenly can see something and all of a sudden the whole world looks different to them and they can never unsee it. Right. And that's how my life has been since I started my journey, probably a year and a half, 2 years ago, and started reading all of the, what I would say, not the common literature that's out there. It's becoming more common, but guys like, again, you start listening to Andy Huberman and you start listening to Peter Attia, and they cite every drop of literature. It's all evidence-based stuff. And when you start learning about what's going on out there, you realize that if you went to your physician, your regular physician, and said, I want to go get a DEXA scan, they would look at you more than likely and say, why would you do that, James? You're 35 years old. You don't need a DEXA scan, and you're not a woman. And you were talking to me earlier about a theory about malice versus not knowing. Do you want to go through that real fast?
Yeah. So the saying is Hanlon's razor. It's just kind of a expression, and it's never a tribute to malice. What can be explained by a lack of knowledge, and I don't think it's that these, not certainly not all the primary care providers in the United States are trying to intentionally harm people and keep people sick. I know that there's a lot of conspiracies out there, and there are problems with our healthcare system. I'm not going to deny that. But I think that most GPs out there are doing the best they can with the time that they have. And this is where I hear people get frustrated a lot. They're like, well, I only get to see him once a year for 15 minutes, maybe twice a year. And they're always just trying to tell me like, hey, take this prescription. But if you're looking at it, you've got someone that's diabetic, with high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or they're depressed. That's a lot to unpack in 15 minutes. And I think they're really trying to do the best they can. It's like, hey, this has the best odds of, at that point, it's harm reduction. So, if someone has high blood pressure and they're not going to, adjust the root cause, like we talked about, telling people move more, eat less, not terribly helpful, doesn't lead to
cut down your salt, James. That's my favorite.
Yeah, certainly there are people that are salt sensitive, but for the vast majority of people, they cut down salt, especially if they're doing something like keto. Can end up with some, cramping, some brain fog. Workouts aren't going to be particularly good. I don't know if you've experienced any of that along with the keto or had to adjust your
I take in
electrolytes.
salt like a deer licking a salt lick. I have no problem with it because, again, but 90% of people walking around with high blood pressure today, not the ones who potentially could get it, who actually have high blood pressure, 90% of them do not have sodium associated or sodium dependent, meaning salt plays no role whatsoever in their high blood pressure. And again, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that was the literature that I had read. And even moreover, there's good reasons not to have a crazy sodium diet without drinking a lot of liquids. Your kidneys, osmotic gradients. There's reasons why you should not just go eat salt for no good reason. But right,
Yeah.
you'd agree. But physicians for years, and there's some still out there, will say keep a low sodium diet if you have high blood pressure, without doing any genetic or epigenetic testing to see if you're even salt dependent high blood pressure. Right?
Yeah. And that's a test that I think could be done a lot better. People go into the doctor's office and they get walked down a hall, hop up on a scale. They're kind of stressed out. They sit down and they're immediately getting their blood pressure taken. A lot of times, if you just wait till the end of the visit, recheck that blood pressure, it might be normal. And this is something people can check at home. There's some cuffs that they're not perfect, but they'll kind of get you in the ballpark. And people want to make sure that they're not super stressed out. They've been sitting down 3-5 minutes. They're fairly relaxed, arms at heart level, legs not crossed, all that good stuff. And you can check this at home. And like you said, the fluid volume you're taking in along with that sodium load is going to be important. Yeah, if you take 10 salt pills a day and you're not drinking any water, that's probably going to be a problem. But if you're sufficiently hydrated and you're not just eating a bunch of processed food that has, carbs that are going to stimulate insulin, that's going to drive sodium retention and just kind of put fuel on that fire, like the average person we talked about, too many refined carbohydrates, not enough fruits, vegetables, not really much with nutritional value that they're taking in, then by eliminating sodium, they might eliminate some of those bad foods, but it's not necessarily the sodium for the majority of people that's a problem.
Yeah, and two things I'd love to cover real quick. One of them I broached a little earlier relates to, first of all, workouts. Right? I want to talk about workouts because a lot of the orthodontists listening right now, a lot of sort of endemic to the orthodontic industry that most orthodontists love to work out or take care of themselves, and we're a competitive breed. Love posting PRs and everything else on there. But I do want to talk about working out a little bit for health span, for long health, and I do want to talk about some of the diet, jumping into diet a little bit more, if that's okay with you.
Hmm.
I'll start with the diet part of it. I have friends who are carnivore diet guys. I'm keto. I really try to keep my carbohydrate intake to lower than 20 grams of net carbs per day if I can. And when I do, it's usually things like almond flour or coconut flour or things that I'm using to cook with. And again, I won't be like this the rest of my life, but I'm in a phase where I'm really feeling good and I'm trying to just lose more fat. And until the bug no longer hits me, I'm going to keep doing it. And it's very easy for me to live and I feel good and I've got lots of energy and I'm sleeping okay with it. And, it's working for me. I'm not forcing a square peg into a round hole. But what's the general feeling about people who are eating a lot of red meat, a lot of fatty chicken, right? I'm not talking processed foods. I'm talking about whole food that happens to be high in fat. And the reason I ask is because my father, who's a dentist, he saw me about a month after I started this journey. I hadn't lost a ton of weight yet, but he begged me. Literally begged me and said, "Please stop this diet. You're eating all this red meat. You're going to die. You're going to have a heart attack from this." I said, "Dad, trust me on this. Just I'm getting my blood drawn every 4 to 6 weeks just so we can monitor and see what's happening. The numbers that you've been told by your physician to monitor are not the numbers that we need to be monitoring. There's lots of other things that we need to be looking at about stickiness of cholesterol and what we've got." And I say, "Just trust me on this." What are the thoughts about people who are on a carnivore diet, on a keto diet, who are losing visceral body fat, who are dropping their A1C, whose resting blood glucose is lower? Maybe all the studies I've read talk about evidence of reducing all the bad numbers over time, though I have to admit, and when I go through it on my own labs, you'll see some of my numbers from a macro level have actually gone up in some ways. But the numbers that really matter deep down below have actually dropped precipitously. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on do keto diets work long term? If someone's comfortable doing it and can live like that, is it a good way to go long term? And what are the thoughts about uh, the modern blood markers that we're looking at? Sorry for such a broad question.
No, and it's a great question, one that we hear about all the time. People are improving their health on keto or even some of the more extreme, like, a carnivore sort of diet. Objectively, if someone is going from being overweight or obese to a healthy BMI and they're no longer pre-diabetic and all those things are moving in the right direction, short term, it's sort of a drop in the bucket, depending on the time frame we're looking at. And the endpoint that I'm not looking at is necessarily, okay, what is this person's LDL cholesterol for the next 3 months, but more so, okay, what about the endpoint that we actually care about? Because there's probably about a 5%, maybe 10% of people that have, elevated cholesterol that are not going to have any plaque in their coronaries. I posted about a study like this just the other day. They looked at all these high risk individuals, and the study was looking at the superiority of a CCTA, so coronary angiography compared to something like just a stress test. And at the end of the study period, it was 4 or 5 years, the group that got a CCTA at baseline, lower cardiac mortality, less cardiac events. They were prompted to go and get stents put in and get bypass and things like that earlier because they saw the problem. So that's the endpoint that I really care about: is do people have plaque in the coronaries? And calcium score can be a good test. It's probably a little bit more accessible to people. Where I used to live in Indiana, a lot of hospital systems offer this without a doctor's order, just to increase access to care.
And I've had
Obviously,
one done myself as well. I've had
Mhm.
a calcium score, and again, my cholesterol's always been a little bit on the higher side, not high enough where I needed to take a drug, but I've started things like chicory root, which has been good. I've started taking red yeast rice with coenzyme Q10. I've taken a lot of the secondary things, and again, going keto hopefully long term will help. But my calcium score was literally zero. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what a calcium score is, because I didn't know anything about it. I can't do a CCTA, oddly enough. For those people out there who want to know, when they do a CAT scan of your heart and infuse you with a little bit of a disclosing, not disclosing solution, but a contrast solution to look at your heart rate has to match with the CBCT. The way the CT measures you, it syncs with your heart rate. And if your heart rate gets above a certain level, you can't do it. And so 3 times I've gone into the machine, and 3 times my heart rate's been in the mid 70s, which doesn't sound like high, but it's too high for them to run the test. And I have to ask how anybody can go through it, because when they stick a needle in you and slide you in a machine, your heart's going to go up a little bit. And so at some point, I'm going to be knocked out and probably have to go through it. But right now, my calcium score is 0 from a regular CT. And if you want to explain to people what a calcium score is, because again, until 3-4 months ago, I'd never even known about it.
Yeah, for sure. And there's actually been some guidelines that have came out with calcium scores. Your score is 0. That's fantastic. We know there's no advanced disease there, nothing that's been there long enough to have calcified.
Right.
And there's not likely to be substantial stenosis. It doesn't mean it's impossible. There may be a speck of plaque in there somewhere. But if that calcium score is above 300, calcium score, calcified plaque, the higher the number, the more
And this is
calcified
measured in
plaque.
square millimeters?
There's a millimeter volume there. It's not necessarily what correlates with the actual calcium score, but when you look at a CCTA for comparison, now they have CAD-RAD staging. So it used to be, it's like, okay, you've got plaque or you don't have plaque. Like, it's very binary. Now you have CAD-RADs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, if someone has CAD-RADs 1, they may have a calcium score of 0, somewhere between 1 and 24% stenosis there. Obviously, obstructive coronary artery disease is above 70% stenosis. That's somebody that probably needs to go get an angioplasty, get that artery open back up. But there's sort of this gray area. So yourself, you said you're 55?
Yeah, I'm 55.
Yeah. So coronary artery calcium score for yourself of 0, that's a pretty good indicator. If I have let's say a 20-year-old who's a carnivore and they've got an LDL of 400 and they're like, but my calcium score is 0. To me, that's a little bit less reassuring, because it's like, yeah, they're 20. They could be smoking and doing every single thing wrong, and we wouldn't expect there to be plaque there. At a certain point, there's a threshold where we start to be concerned and say, well, let's talk about what's a little bit more reasonable to do long term, or get a little bit better test. You sort of go down these two paths, right? So you can either be proactive and intervene, or we can go look and see, is there a problem there? And it's not a test you would get done very frequently. And just to your point, because this may help you out with, if you do decide to get a CCTA, did you pre-medicate with metoprolol? Or a lot of times they'll even give a dose of IV metoprolol.
I had a dose of metoprolol. The problem, for the guy who came into the room before I did my first one started telling me on a machine, by the way, I just have to tell you, it's a very, very small risk, but people have died doing this. And immediately like, okay, thanks for that. No chance I'm ever going to, it's like a pilot telling you, there's a decent chance, not a big one, but you could die on this airplane. Suddenly you don't want to fly so much. And so
that's why they don't say that when you take off, right? You see your captain speaking, they reassure you. They don't say, hey, we might crash.
Yeah. I mean, so he came in his room, his bedside manner was horrendous. And from that point forward, again, it's not, a resting heart rate. My heart rate would be in the 50s and 60s. And then they, when they get ready with the contrast, my heart rate would go to like 74, which again is low, but too high for them to be able to do it. So at some point, my physician said, look, you got a calcium score of 0. You're a non-smoker. You work out 6 days a week. You do resistance training. I've literally, knock on wood, nobody in my family has ever had a cardiac event of any kind on either side of my family going back 3 generations. As far as we know, nobody's ever had a heart attack. There's been some strokes in smokers, but his point was you don't have the genetics for it. You have a calcium score of 0. You eat pretty well, and now I eat way better, and you exercise all the time. I don't feel the need to have to put you through sedation to go get a CCTA when your risk is remarkably low for a cardiac event. You could get hit by a bus tomorrow, but having a heart attack is probably not going to be in your future down the road. Both parents are still alive. Grandparents lived in their 80s and 90s. None of them ever had a heart attack. So again, we're going to hold off on the possibly death-inducing CCTA, or at least what he said. But again, your point is well made. If you're in your 30s, I guess that's where my question goes back to. I'm 36 years old. I feel great. I'm a little overweight. Should I really care about this stuff? Or is this just, come on, James, Glenn, you're blowing this out of proportion. Why do I really need to know about this in my 30s? Let my kids grow up a little bit. Let me have a little more time to myself. I'll eat better. I'll work out better, and I'll be fine.
Yeah. And this is where it goes into sort of, all these tests that you probably should be getting done if you're wanting to be, 10 out of 10 in terms of prevention and optimized and functioning at your best. Because if you feel better, your productivity is going to go up. If you get hit with a early cardiac event that you had no idea it was coming because you've got a LP little a that's 400 that nobody ever tested, that's going to, your productivity is definitely going to take a hit. You're going to miss a ton of time of work. You're probably not going to feel great because then you're going to be on, probably metoprolol afterwards, and you're going to have some fatigue. Medications do have side effects to them. That's not to say they don't have a place. But you don't want to tell a horror story to everyone that comes in. But the reality is, even if that only happens to, say 1 in 100,000 people, for somebody that's going to be their one of one, and they're going to live that experience.
Yep.
So, tests that I think about, I'm sure you've mentioned on the show, or we may have mentioned, the ApoB, lipoprotein little a. And ApoB is basically a net sum of your, I call it atherogenic risk potential from a lipid standpoint. So we know higher ApoB is associated with a higher risk of having a vascular event, heart attack or stroke later in life. The lipoprotein little a is a really interesting one because it's incredibly common. About 1 in 5 people will have an elevated level, but they don't test for it right now. I believe because there's not a treatment necessarily. If you're looking at lipoprotein little a, you have this elevated level, then you typically want to be more aggressive with everything else you're doing, blood pressure control, getting metabolically healthy, getting to a healthy BMI, and definitely not being sort of skinny fat, which we can get into, because you can have a BMI that's 23, right on the money, but you can have very little muscle mass and a lot of adiposity. So iron studies are another one that I have some patients who come in and they've never had an iron study done. And we found probably a handful of patients in our practice that would have developed problems from hemochromatosis down the line if they had not just gotten this iron study as part of the panel, because you can see, the ferritin 700, have you ever had this checked before? And they say no. And you've probably done that patient a huge service just by checking an iron level. Same thing, more so on the women's side, iron deficiency. A lot of women are fatigued and have trouble sleeping and low energy, and they're cold all the time. And that can be as simple as an iron deficiency too, which is incredibly easy to treat.
And by the way, LP little a, you can't change that, can you? That's a genetic risk, right?
You can't change it with any of the standard medications that are out there now. If you look at some of the cutting edge agents like the PCSK9 inhibitors, you can get about a 30% reduction at best. Interestingly, if I have a postmenopausal woman, get a baseline lipoprotein little a on her when her estradiol level is undetectable, and then you replace estradiol, replace testosterone, or specifically oral androgens. So, oral testosterone, like one of these testosterone undecanoates, or a very low dose of oxandrolone will actually drop that lipoprotein little a bit. So there's some things in clinical trials at Cleveland Clinic now that are much more laser targeted, that are going to get that lowered by about 90%. Because they're looking at it, treating it in a genetic way, interfering with the way that those genes express themselves, so then you don't end up with that downstream protein. So there are some things you can do. It can make the case for testosterone replacement more compelling in a man or a woman, because you can actually lower that lipoprotein little a little bit. And the reason it's thought to be more problematic is because it's a sort of, if we thought of LDL as, historically the bad cholesterol, which we know is cholesterol is kind of all the same. It's just a lipoprotein that carries cholesterol. The lipoprotein little a, we could call it the worst cholesterol, because it's a much smaller particle and seems to be associated with a much higher rate of cardiac events, especially after someone's already had their first event.
And again, when people go to their doctor, they're going to hear about their cholesterol, their LDL, their HDL, right? VLDL. But like, there's so many things out there that, like HSCRP, fibrinogen antigen, troponin, right? TMAO. I mean, homocysteines, and your methylation profile. I mean, there's so many things out there. I mean, I could go on and on for hours with different things that now they've studied. I will tell you personally, my thoughts are that it's impossible to look at every one of your little micro markers out there and not at some point get a little bit jaded and go, come on. I mean, like, it's a little ridiculous, but it just underscores the fact that they're studying so much right now and learning. And I do think some of the studies are a bit flawed. I do think there are studies that talk about, retrospective analysis, like LP little a, for instance. Like, we followed 1,000 people, and 500 of them had high LPA and 500 of them had, regular LPA. And the ones who had higher LPA, LP little a, had twice as many cardiac events as the other group. But again, how did you select specifically for LP little a, other than the fact that these people had high LP little a? Were there other factors involved? And I think sometimes the studies, this is just looking at it from a researcher's perspective, are a little bit flawed. But the point that I want to make here is that they're looking at everything now. And
Mhm.
it's not just about high cholesterol, because your triglycerides might be high. But what does that really mean? It doesn't mean anything if all the other markers look good, if your calcium score is zero, if you've been through, some sort of marker in your heart where you've looked at things and seen what the studies show. And so I'm just hoping that people out there who are in their 30s who say, I'm feeling a little stressed out in my life. I feel as a mom or a dad, my life is kind of crazy, and I'm not sleeping the way I should, and I'm not exercising as much as I should, and I'm not taking enough time for myself, and I feel a little bit mentally on my edge from time to time. These are markers, people. These are warning signs. If somebody came to you, James, and said, "Look, I'm 38 years old. I'm an orthodontist. I try to eat pretty well most of the time, but on the weekends I kind of go a little crazy. My kids run me ragged. I'm all over the place, taking them to soccer and lacrosse and ballet and gymnastics, and I don't really get a whole lot of time for me, myself. I do feel stressed out. I'm not really sleeping the way I should. I still work out, although, I'm kind of tired at night. I crash on my couch." Is that somebody who you're going to pull aside and say, okay, let's talk a little bit about ways to make you healthier, as opposed to the pervasive approach, which I hear so often is, I'll get there one day. I'll get there one day. And all the while, these are markers of potential damage happening, are they not?
Yeah, I mean, when you said falling asleep on the couch, my mind goes to sleep apnea, which is extremely underrecognized, undertreated. And in your profession, you probably see some of these patients where they've got, oropharyngeal airspace crowding, and you're like, oh, this person's overweight, and they've got this. It's the genetic hand that they've been dealt in terms of their anatomy, and then also that they have this metabolic syndrome and diabetes or whatever on top of it. So it's like, oh yeah, before you even run the test, that this person has sleep apnea. So pulling those people aside, a lot of times you can get to a root cause. It's like, hey, yeah, your brain's missing out on oxygen because you're having a pause in your breathing every single minute of the night. I've seen people with AHIs that are over 60, meaning they have more than one pause, more than one period of apnea every minute that they're asleep overnight. So, that's someone that you definitely do want to take aside. You want to say, hey, we want to look at these things. You want to look at family history. Like in your case, you have a fairly clean bill of health from a cardiac standpoint, and then you've done the appropriate imaging. Some people, they have cancers that run forwards and backwards. They have dementia or other neurocognitive issues, and you can get some genetic testing to see, hey, did you pick up those ApoE alleles from mom and dad? Because we know that there can be 3 to 4x risk if you're carrying one allele, maybe close to 10 if you're carrying two ApoE4 alleles. In our practice, there's another test that we can do. It's a genetic mitochondrial marker that's associated with Alzheimer's now. It's been replicated in 4 cohorts called SH-Moose. And it's a little bit expensive because it's whole genome sequencing and you have to manually go in and find that gene. But if you have an issue there, you definitely want to make sure you're optimizing mitochondrial function because it's not as big as ApoE, but it's showing 30 to 60% risk depending on which cohort you look at. So you really want to be minimizing all those things. That can be a turning point for somebody. You pull something out of their blood work, something out of the analysis, and say, hey, you need to take this seriously. You're at a 3-4x increased risk for Alzheimer's, and that can be powerful for women when they're going through menopause. The KEEPS trial, which was looking at actually one of the rare trials looking at bioidentical estradiol in a transdermal form, found that the women treated with that who had an ApoE4 allele had less accumulation of the amyloid plaques, which isn't the whole story. But if the question is, do you want more or less amyloid plaque, then the answer is going to be less. So there's a lot of these little things you can do to really alter the trajectory of somebody's course. And that decision happens, in a moment. There's sometimes things just click. Somebody, they have their first kid and they're like, wow, I need to take my health seriously. Or they get a health scare of some sort. Or, they get some blood work back and they're like, hey, this doesn't look very good. I don't want to continue down this course.
And by the way, as we sort of wind up here a little bit, as we get out of time, at the end of the day, the real key here is that my friend Jeff Galvin, a physician I told you about earlier, he
Mm-hmm.
made this comment that really resonated with me. He said, if you sit and shoot a bullet at a target 100 yards away, he goes, if you're off by 1 degree, that's a 6-foot miss at 100 yards. He said, wouldn't you rather get the bullet when it's 20 feet out of the gun and still has, another 90 yards or whatever it might be, plus to adjust the bullet and get it back on track, as opposed to waiting till the bullet is 5 feet off target and you've got 10 yards left and you'll never get that bullet back on the target. And the fact of the matter is that if you're in your 30s and you're not sleeping well, it could be hormonal, it could be diet, it could be something genetic rearing its head a little bit, it could be a precursor for something bigger coming down the road. I would encourage everybody out there to see somebody like James or like Jeff Galvin or somebody like them who's going to put you through a battery of tests so you really can uncover what's going on, to help you sleep better, to help you function better, to be a better parent, to be a better spouse, to be a better friend, to be a better boss, better worker, whatever you want to be. But the one thing we never got to that I want to ask you about is when it comes to working out, when I was growing up, it was about aerobics, right? Back in the 80s, everybody was getting physical, as Olivia Newton-John would say, right? Everybody had their headband and their leg warmers, right? A la Flashdance. Nowadays, if I said to you, I'm 35 years old, I want to live my best life for the rest of my life, not just now. I want to look my best, I want to feel my best, and I want to age my best. What are some do's and don'ts that you might throw my way when it comes to exercise?
That's where the bulk of exercise research has been historically, was on aerobic exercise, because it was very accessible. Anybody can go out, go for a jog. You don't need a lot of equipment to do that. And now the tide is kind of turning, and there's a lot more attention on resistance training, weightlifting, the high intensity versus lower intensity exercise. So if I'm building out a blueprint, depends on how much time the person has. But if we assume they have a good, 10 hours a week to work out, then
which is a lot. 10 hours is a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real commitment. 10 hours. You said 10 hours a week. That's 2 hours a day, 5 days a week.
Yeah. So what's my, I guess, budget here, hypothetically?
Let's assume that if you said to me, hey, I don't have 2 hours a day to work out, I'd say, okay, I get that. I respect that. I don't have a problem with that. But if you said, I can't find 45 minutes a day to work out, now I'm going to give you a hard time, right? If I said, look, I got 45 minutes, 5 days a week that I can work out, right? I got 45 minutes. That should make a dent, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I would say with that budget, you would want to have at least one high intensity session per week. So I recommend, this is the one time I do recommend getting on like an exercise bike, doing something that's a little bit safer if you're going to be pushing the intensity. Because if I tell everyone to go out and run hill sprints, somebody's going to get hurt if they're doing that every single week. So far, knock on wood, nobody's crashed their exercise bike on me. But the key there is to have your work interval slightly longer than your rest interval. So you could do 2 minutes on, a minute and a half off. And starting with 10 minutes for most patients that I talk to this about, they're like, wow, that really kicked my butt. And then they build up, and you don't have to go crazy with it. 20 minutes, you get a great workout in. And then the resistance training should be probably 2 to 3 times per week. And if you're working with that limited time scale, if you can recover from it, full body. If not, then you can split that up and do sort of a push-pull leg sort of program where you're dividing the different body parts, because I don't want someone to be so sore that they can't move around the next day, because then they're not going to like that. They're not going to go back and work out anymore. And
We've
then the
all been
remainder,
there. Leg day.
Leg day. Yeah, and then trying to sit down and stand
2
up.
days later,
day, right?
You can't sit down without looking like you got punched in the thigh.
Yeah. Everybody say, oh, why is that guy moving so slow coming into work today? I don't want to do whatever workout program he's on.
Exactly.
But yeah, then the remainder of that time should be something that's lower intensity, that's more than just like a walk around the neighborhood. So, people say zone 2, and I'm not too much of a stickler on where people put their zone 2 at, but basically to where you're not really taxing yourself. It's kind of an active recovery day. Maybe your heart rate's somewhere between, 130, 140, depending on what your max heart rate is. So something like that, where you're still getting some aerobic exercise, building that foundation. But there are some things you get from that high intensity that you won't get from the base, but you're spending a very small amount of time there. So your high intensity work is relatively low, and then you're building the foundation with a larger amount of that sort of moderate intensity cardio. And that can be, even a sport that you enjoy. Here in Overland Park, pickleball is very popular. Some people play, tennis doubles. Some people, they go biking with the family. There's all kinds of things you can do to sort of stack and not have it feel like, oh, I've got to devote this, 45 minutes to whatever it may be, but to where it's something you enjoy. Because if you like it, you're going to stick with it.
Yeah. And my workouts in the morning are about an hour long, usually resistance training 5 days a week. Maybe one day a week I get on the Peloton and just, or the rower and really try to get the heart rate up a little bit. Or I'll try to get that 150 minutes a week combined of zone 2 training. But I threw jujitsu in the evenings now, or in the mornings to alternate so that I'll do my
Mhm.
weight and then I'll go to my jujitsu. And I get 45 minutes to an hour of light cardio, but lots of stretching, lots of movement, working on quickness again, because that's something I found when I was losing a lot of. And
Mhm.
it's just been, like you said, if you love it, it makes life that much easier to follow with it. And folks, even if you don't love it, you better do it because it's not going to do itself. James, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for you being here today. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if people want to follow myself and some of the information I put out, I try to give a lot of tips and just health information that people might not find otherwise. My Instagram is at James O'Hara NP. Uh, my clinic that I co-founded, the website for that is GillettHealth.com, where people can go and order some of these blood tests that we talked about that they may not be able to get with their primary care provider. And then we do also offer individualized medicine. So if you are that 35-year-old and you want to get started with your health, but you don't know where to go, then you can do a free intake, talk with our team about what we do and how we can help you. So yeah, that's where people can find me and work with me. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's one of those things that, as you could probably guess, we could sit and talk here, you and me, for probably a full day, going through every test,
Absolutely.
every opinion. But the takeaway from all of this, folks, is number one, I don't care how old you are, it's never too early to get started learning about where you are. And hopefully the test results will tell you you're in great shape. At worst, it's going to help you change the trajectory of that bullet as early as you possibly can. Number two, understand that 5-10 minutes you spend with your physician once a year is not sufficient. My friend had seen his physician who said he had risk, high blood pressure, eat better, exercise, and I'll see you in a year. And between visits, he had a heart attack. So again, be proactive. Nobody's going to be your advocate for your health the way you will. And if you've got things that you just shrug off, like I'm not sleeping well, I feel really stressed, I'm hanging on from time to time, but I'll get through it. It may not be a mental health issue alone. It could be an actual visceral, body physical health issue related to a hormone. And there's help out there. So please reach out to James, reach out to somebody, reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch with somebody. But definitely, please be proactive in your health and understand that what we're learning is changing the foundations of how we act every single day. And James, I can't thank you enough for being here. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get you back on at some later date and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. I'd love to. And, such a great takeaway. Really good closing statements you made there.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. We've got several stressors in our life. We've got a great profession, but we've got to deal with overhead. We've got to deal with productivity. We got to deal with team members that are outside of our control sometimes. And the great news is, all of these issues are addressed in depth in this year's curriculum at Orthopreneurs Summit. So please go to opsummit2023.com, sign up for the meeting that's almost sold out, that everybody's going to be talking about, that you really need to be at to be your best practice with the lowest stress and highest profitability. opsummit2023.com. Please join me there so that I can take care of you even better than you take care of your patients.